So happy Father's Day to all of the fathers in the room, to all of the fathers that we have. Glad to see so many people here. A couple of weeks ago, I was hoping for some brave fathers who would speak this morning. They were all a little quiet. So I followed that up with an email to some of the fathers in our congregation, and some of them responded, and then I followed up with a phone call. But I'm very pleased to say that we have several fathers here today who are willing to speak for a little bit. And the questions I put out was, what do you love most about being a father? The other one was, what has gotten you through in the challenging times, or who has gotten you through? And then the last question was, what, if anything, did faith have to do with it? So I know of three people who are willing to respond to that, Lewis and Oak and David. Any of you want to start? Anybody? I'll take it. Yeah. If not, Lois is close.
Well, one of the questions, the first question is basically, what's important? What do we like about being a father? And the interesting thing is, it's a challenging. People don't necessarily realize it until they look at their own father, and that's where I went with this question. Was how am I able to celebrate my children's victories and console them when they're in need, and to get a little extra bump when they do something really spectacular. So it's, to me, on a day-to-day basis, it's, at this point, it's not very noticeable, but when I go back and look, there's been miracles. There's been a lot of miracles. And to address your third statement about faith, I think faith is necessary for a parent and for a father, because if you don't have faith, things are going to look pretty bleak at times. And at other times, it's great, you know. Just so I find being a father very rewarding, and I think that it's important for our children to realize that no matter what they do, we love them.
Thank you, Lewis. Thank you for that. Oak.
Well, I want you to picture this. The year is 1962. I'd just been married. Mary was licensed and graduate physical therapist in Madison, Wisconsin. You know what's coming. And I was in my second semester of law school. So I had a habit of going home for lunch. And on September 2nd, 1963, this person was born. So now if you want to start counting, that's, you know, they used to count in those days, now they don't. Anyway, that was an utter shock, because I was last in my family. I had an older brother and sister, so I was spoiled and self-centered and egotistical and incompetent in handling a baby. And Mary went back to the hospital for a little infection, and I'm taking care of her, who's this big. And I could not change a diaper. It was a very big problem. So I had to go to class, law school class. So I did the right thing. I called my parents. And Thank God they came up and they swaddled her. They got her all together, and that was great. And Mary came back, and her mother came, and everything was fine. And my competency as a father got a little better over the years, but not much. And I had a good time with it. You know, we really had fun together. And one of the great experiences as a father is we took a road trip to see in-laws in the East. And we went to Niagara Falls, and we went under the falls. Julie was 3. And there's a place under the falls you can go and walk through. And she thought she was having a hair wash. And so I assured her it was all right. It's been a good, fun game.
Thank you, Oak.
I don't know about the best thing, but one of the good things is dad jokes. And not so much that the jokes are good, but for years, particularly the adolescence, my daughters, if I did a bad joke, would do this little, Daddy. Well, the joy about that is, of course, now I find them doing dad jokes. So, but more seriously, I think probably the biggest joy is just each stage of development is a joy. And I kept thinking, oh, gee, the last phase was good, but this one's even better. And even adolescence, mostly. Yeah, so that I think is the big joy, just watching that develop and being part of that and participating in it, and guided by, of course, Kathy. The challenging part, I think, the most challenging thing was when I was diagnosed with lymphoma, to see the terror in them. I guess I hadn't quite appreciated how important I am to them. And I guess that is the next stage of their growth, too, to deal with that issue. But how to get through that, there is a sense of they rose to the challenge, and certainly Kathy was supportive and terrified, too, at that time. And I guess that I have a kind of blessed with an innate sense of optimism. I don't think it's naive, everything turns out, but we'll live it today and figure it out. In terms of faith, yes, it is a leap of faith. Yeah, I quit my job at 40, we moved cross country, and we had a baby. But it worked out. But the faith is really the sense of awe at them and what they all represent. Isn't that a great word, awe? Awesome, awful, and both are true in both senses. And sometimes I flash back now, I guess it was last year now. Rachel got up with me very early in the morning. We went out in the canoe in Tomales Bay, and it was just perfect glass. And we could enjoy that sense of awe. And then I was watching Becca at the ranch where she works with the autistic kids and their families, and she was so good with them. Oh my. I said, where'd that come from? And that's the great joy, and that's the kind of sense, and that is a faith experience too, because it's the awesome and awful.
Thank you, David. Yes. I was hoping Mr. Bob DeHaan.
It's been written that 50% of success is just showing up on time. I have 4 children, 8 grandchildren, and 2 greats. Two wonderful great-grandsons. The oldest one is going through puberty at the moment. I will see him in about a week. So I got a card from my one daughter this morning, Father's Day card, and she said, the sense was, Dad, you've been there all the time. And when I read all the stories in the paper and otherwise about the number of men who, for whatever reason, abandon their families are not there for the families. They get carried away. They have romances they shouldn't have, et cetera, et cetera. And I look back at my own dad. He was always there. He was uneducated and didn't achieve much, but he achieved 2 sons, both of whom have done well. So be there consistently to set a pattern for your family.
Thank you. Any other fathers who want to speak? All right. Thank you. It's really wonderful to hear the heart of fathers in our midst this morning. In 2014, then President Barack Obama, in his Father's Day address, said, "What makes you a man isn't the ability to have a child, it's the courage to raise one." It's the courage to raise one. And love seems to be the fuel of that courage. So we want to thank today all of the fathers, all those who have stepped in father roles, and thank them for their courage and their love. Now, my parents got married in 1945, right after the Second World War ended in the Netherlands. And the country at that time found itself in a very deep depression. And people didn't have anything. There wasn't anything. Everything was gone. Buildings needed to be rebuilt, infrastructure, schools, jobs. And so my parents were 19 and 21 when they got married, which means they were teenagers during the war. I never realized that, but looking back, it's like, oh, these were 2 traumatized, war-traumatized teenagers that got married at age 19 and 21, and a year later they had their first child. No education, no money, on their way to parent, at some point, 6 children. Now, my dad worked several jobs. He did home study courses at night. And I remember that by the time I came around, that we had this little safety box with a lock on it. And in it was 100 guilders that they had saved up, and that was for emergencies. Trouble was that what my dad considered an emergency and what my mother considered an emergency was vastly different. So that 100 guilders never got spent, I think. My dad worked his whole life in the same factory, raised up from being in the mailroom to eventually being the head manager of the accounting department, but he never really got that kind of social style, that kind of swagger that people sometimes have in upper management. And so by the time he retired, they were giving him a gold watch, and he said, "Please do not engrave it so I can sell it." My mom convinced him not to do that, and I think the watch ended up with that same 100 guilders in that safety box, never to be looked at again. And I know that's what happened after the war. At that time, that happens after every war, that people will get married, have children. But the same question, what, if anything, prepared them for parenthood? What, if anything, prepared a father to be a father? And if my dad was alive these days, I would ask him that question. What was it that got you through? What gets any of us through? Now, our scripture reading today details the call of some of the disciples. Jesus gets in the boat with Simon Peter, and they throw out their nets, and then this miraculous catch follows. And Simon and the other disciples recognize that Jesus is not an ordinary man, that he's really sent by God. And when Jesus invites them to follow him, they leave their nets and do just that. But what, if anything, prepared them to be disciples? So often we read that they're really at a loss of what kind of a job they're about to do, lost at trying to understand what Jesus is coming to do. And they say things like, Jesus, what do you mean when you talk about the realm of God? What do you mean when you say you will be with us forever? And only after 3 or 4 years, they're asked to be preaching the gospel, to be disciples. And it seems that the call to discipleship, and it seems that the call to fatherhood, that nobody seems to be well prepared. The call to parenthood, it doesn't look like we are well prepared. It is simply not a requirement. There's a quote, I think, by E.E. Cummings that says something like, "Who in being called knows what the call is summoning them to?" Who in being called knows what this call is summoning them to? And already knowing what you're stepping into is not a requirement for discipleship. It's not a requirement to become or to be a father. And even along the way, we never get to a place, I think, where we can stand and say, okay, now I know what I am doing. I got it all figured out. It looks like at every bend of the road, there is a new challenge that requires us to surrender, to open up, to grow until very, very far into adulthood. A colleague and friend of mine recently spoke about a 90-year-old woman who she had in her meditation group. And this woman was talking about her 70-year-old son and said, we've always had such a hard relationship. We're so at odds with each other. And she said during this time of meditation, these 4 years that she'd been part of the group, she said, I finally am able to disengage a bit, to make some more space and to find some more compassion for my son. And she said, as I am doing that, I'm noticing that the edges around our relationship are starting to soften. Sometimes it only takes one of the 2 or 3 to start making changes to have an effect on the dynamics. Through the practice of prayer, through the practice of meditation, we can learn to pause and give ourselves and each other some more space. Space to accept our failings, space to repair, space to forgive, and space to come back again. Not always. Sometimes coming back together needs to happen just in our own being so that we can move on from painful situation. But stepping back, we allow space for God's grace to enter in. We allow space for God's grace to soften our hearts. What gets us through? What gets us through the challenging times? For my father, it was his stubborn drive to stay with us. Like Robert de Haan said, this staying power that got him through. It got all of us through. And I honor him for that. And I never thought of that as a form of courage, but I think it is. I think this willingness to stay with, to go through whatever you're going through, to go through the challenges of life and to stay with it, I think that is a form of courage. So our hearts this morning go out to the fathers and mothers in all of the places where they are struggling with circumstances beyond their control to protect their children. Our hearts go out to all of the parents who, for circumstances beyond their control, are unable to feed their children. It's one of the hardest things, I think, for a parent is not to be able to protect your child. Jesus said, "Come follow me," to his disciples. And then he said, "Just as the Father loved me, so I love you. So abide in me. Abide in this love." There's no need to have it all figured out. You do not need to be prepared. You just need to stay with this love. And then you will find God's love and God's staying power. God has some mighty staying power. You will find God's staying power, no matter what. So I want to thank again all of the men and all those who have been in fathering roles, through whose life we get to see glimpses of God's love, through whose lives we get to see glimpses of God's staying power. Today is Father's Day. We honor our fathers and we honor the fathers among us. We have for the fathers in our midst, of those who are in fathering roles, there's in the narthex, a bowl with a flashlight. Jesus said, "I'm the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of light." So thank you all.